Hello, welcome to the Scottish History Podcast. I'm Chris.
And I'm Peter.
Remember to check us out on Facebook and Twitter.
So in this episode, we're going to think about the politics of early historic Scotland, and this was actually a time before Scotland as a kingdom existed. Between 410 AD and 900, politics in the region that would become Scotland, what we're describing as the Scottish region, played out between 5 separate political groups, each with their own language and culture. So we've got the Kingdom of Dal Riadans, Pictland, the Vikings, the British kingdoms, and the Angle Kingdom of Northumbria. This episode considers what the political vehicles were that society got around in the run-up to the invention of the idea of Alba, the Gaelic word for Scotland. By 900 AD, Alba had become the chosen title for a kingdom in the north of the British Isles. It's around this idea of Alba that our modern concept of Scotland, or the Kingdom of Scotland, and its histories gets going.
Imagine you're looking at a map of Scotland, almost like a board game. We're asking ourselves, in the Scottish region, in the time frame of 410 AD to 900 AD, who are the players, the societies and cultures on the map making the decisions? What do we understand about them? How organized were these societies? Are they painted savages or coordinated peoples with taxes, writing, and laws? The hope is to gain a picture of the time and to explore some of the tools and narratives that historians and archaeologists use to understand the history of Scotland before Scotland. This episode is in 2 parts. The first part is a broad story describing roughly how the kingdoms interacted over time, make their appearances, and for some, their exits. The second half zooms in on each of the 5 kingdoms to consider some aspects of their histories.
We start with the withdrawal of Imperial Rome. By the time Rome withdrew, 2 walls had been built clear across northern Britain, separating the British tribes of the north from those of the south. The first and better known is Hadrian's Wall, began in 122 AD, which runs along from the Solway Firth, round about the city of Carlisle, and east over to Newcastle. The second is the Antonine Wall, begun in 142 AD, built further along into the Scottish region on the neck of land between the Clyde and the Forth rivers. The pressure exerted by the empire into the north would intensify and ebb away over 400 years of imperial presence in Britain. When the empire left, a new political and economic dynamic was put in place, which those living on either side of the walls would have to deal with. Out of the withdrawal in 410 AD, space was opened up for new political units to take the lead in organising society over the next century. In the space between the 2 Roman walls, roughly the south of the Scottish region, that's much of the central belt and everything down towards the borders, several British kingdoms would take responsibility for politics. The Kingdom of Gaelic, based on the site of today's Edinburgh Castle, would grow to administer the southeast of the Scottish region. Leaning against Gaelic was a new force on the Isles, the Angles. With the withdrawal of the Empire, Germanic tribes like the Angles have been invited to the northeast of the English region, known as Northumbria, for help managing raiders from the north. These Angle mercenaries decided they would rather be in charge, and so began to take over Northumbria for themselves, hence the Angle Kingdom of Northumbria. West of Northumbria, the British kingship of Reged would develop around the Solway Firth in the southwest, at times dominating the region, and north from here, along the Clyde River Valley, centred on a fortress perched on and embedded into the rock of an extinct volcano, developed the British Kingdom of Strathclyde. North of the Antonine Wall are the more well-known entities preceding the Kingdom of Scotland, running northeast from what is today Fife, through today's Dundee, Aberdeen, and swinging around towards Inverness and beyond, to encompass Orkney and much of the Western Isles, were the Picts. Southwest from the Picts, across the mountains at the centre of the Scottish region, was the Gaelic kingdom of Dal Riadans, its people known in history as the Scots. Dal Riadans was based northwest of today's Glasgow, near Loch Lomond, and directly across from Northern Ireland.
So by 500 AD, we're dealing with 4 political franchises in Scottish politics. The Picts and the Dal Riadans in the north, and in the south, the British kingdoms and the Angle newcomers in Northumbria. Moving forward in time, and using conflict as our measuring stick, we could instead use trade, language, or religion. The scene evolves, both gradually and dramatically. From 500 AD towards the late 8th century, the Northumbrian Angles take over the territory of Godolphin and expand to soak up Reged and the Solway Firth. Now conflict between Northumbria extended to include the Picts, Scots, and the Strathclyders. But it wasn't a common front. The Scots, Picts, and Strathclyde British would fight one another too, the extent of the authority of the 3 groups oscillating with victory or defeat. In 793, a new force entered the scene, pillaging the monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria. and this is a contemporary quote. Quote, "In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria, and miserably frightened the inhabitants. These were exceptional flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine soon followed these signs, and a little after that, in the same year, the harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter." The Vikings had arrived. They would utterly change the political dynamic of the British Isles. Starting in the late 8th century, an arc of Norse authority would be developed. This was territory utterly lost to the warlords of the Scots and Picts. Strathclyde, Northumbria, and the English region would also be slammed by Viking invasion. In 836, backed by their army, the assembled nobility of the Picts would confront a Viking force and be decisively defeated. Many of the Pictish kingdom's elites and its very king were killed at the battle. The job title of King of Picts was open. Entering the competition to rise to the Pictish kingship was a Dal Riadans Scot, Kenneth MacAlpin, a celebrity in Scottish history. After defeating native Pictish claimants to the throne, by 840 he was established as dual king of both Dal Riada and Pictland. He didn't know it, but he was establishing the Alpin dynasty. A key accomplishment for this dynasty was nurturing the idea of Alba as a name for a defined territory and people, as well as a king. By 900, with King Constantine II, the idea of Alba is said to be established. It's this name which would eventually become Scotland.
Okay, so now we're backtracking to zoom in on the 5 different players who would contend on the map. We've got Dal Riada, Pictland, the Vikings, the British kingdoms, and the Angles. So we're going to start with the Picts. The image that is usually conjured of a native Briton is one of a semi-naked, bearded man with blue war paint abundant on his body. This resonates with the Hollywood productions today, recognizable in films portraying barbarians. Like, if you want to see an example of this, watch the opening scene of Gladiator. We've also got a contemporary Roman comment by a man named Dio, which gets the point across quite well. Quote, "They dwell in tents, naked and unshod, possess their women in common, and in common rear all of their offspring. Their former's rule is democratic for the most part, and they are very fond of plundering. Consequently, they choose their best men as rulers." Another idea is the noble savage, a narrative born in literature from the 18th and 19th centuries by thinkers like Rousseau. Especially with the Picts, we find a romantic idea of who this enigmatic tribe was. The narratives of romantics and by the enemies of the Picts have gained a lot of traction, even the ideas of fantasy writers, suggesting, for example, that Pictland was a kind of lost Atlantis of the north. So this romantic view has been challenged in the recent past to show that the Picts were not all that different from their neighbours. Most of our sources for the Picts are found through Roman or Christian writings, as no evidence survives of their own written or spoken language. In history books, the definition of Picts changes depending on the time period. When Rome first invades Scotland in 73 AD, the Picts are synonymous with the Caledonian Confederation, a loose alliance of tribes combined to fight off the empire. Into the future, a more and more coherent definition develops. A 5th century definition might have been, the Picts are those people who live beyond the walls, northeast of here, who enjoy raiding us by land and sea. By 737 AD, it might be something like, the Picts are a nation, an organised Christian kingdom of northern Britain. Bede, a writer from the time, describes the Picts as a distinct entity of 2 parts, the northern Picts and the southern Picts. An earlier description from the 2nd century AD by a Mediterranean explorer, a guy named Ptolemy, described the Scottish region as being organised among 12 tribes. The north-south model of Pictland means that centralisation had occurred. One idea is that it was pressure from the Roman Empire which required the Picts to unite. The word Picts is generally accepted to have come from the Latin picti, meaning painted or tattooed one, and first appears in a speech by a Roman, Eumenius, in AD 297. It's said that this was a nickname given to the Picts by soldiers manning the walls facing north. Whether this is what the Picts called themselves, though, is unknown. To get a picture of what life was like for the Picts in the absence of written sources, archaeologists do most of the work. They do this by studying evidence like recovered stone carvings, basic goods like clothing and pottery, and luxury goods like recovered coins and jewellery. The historians are invited back to the party again to work with written sources by Pictish neighbours such as the Northumbrians and the Scots, which mention the Picts. While the Pictish language is long gone, historians argue that it was a P-Celtic language, and so a distant relative of modern-day Welsh. Traces still exist in names of towns and cities today. Names containing Aber or Pit mark areas that could have been inhabited by the Picts. Examples of this are Aberdeen, Aberfeldy, or Pitlochry. This is important as it marks where Pictish culture has been most influential in the past. The Pictish stones, which lend them so much mystery and provide great writing prompts, also offer, almost accidentally, insight into Pictish society. Across 200 stones and hundreds of square miles, a common iconography is repeated. There's images like fish, deer, horses, broken swords, combs, and mirrors. This is significant because it means that certain ideas were common currency across the Pictish space. They represent kind of a Pictish broadcasting service, or maybe like a Pictish FM. One theory for what the imagery of the stones meant is that the images held by the stones represented sacrifices to the gods. Sacrificing bent swords and weapons into water was common across Iron Age Britain. Within some of these stones are images of bent swords and spears. Perhaps these stones reinforced the message that the makers were especially devout, but then again, maybe not. Sources of how local life was lived in British kingdoms could also give us a glimpse into what life might have been like for the regular Pict.
In medieval history, when you read or hear someone or something described as British, you're dealing with something very different from the modern idea of British. We're set in the early historic period, so British refers to those people who migrated to the British Isles when they were still connected by land to mainland Europe about 10,000 years ago. These are the hunter-gatherers. The people there would come to be known as Celts, a culture shared across Europe. These are the folks who were invaded by the Roman Empire in 43 AD and were separated north, south, and between the two Roman-built walls. Histories of Scotland sometimes mention how the British kingdoms are underserved by historians. Lucky for us, new histories have been forged by the hard work of historians which give a voice to sidelined peoples and the important role their kingdoms played in Scottish history. Between the two walls would form the British kingdoms described earlier as players in the early historic Scottish region. As the empire departed, British kingdoms rose up to take over leadership. The Godolphin centered in Lothian, which is where Edinburgh is, the Reged on the Solway River around today's Carlisle, and the kingdom of Strathclyde along the River Clyde, an area taking in modern-day Dumbarton, Greenock, and Govan. Direct sources from their culture survive in the form of Brittonic poetry and annals. From these we can discover a sense of their lives and politics. One poem describes the 6th century character of King Urien of Reged. Quote, "Splendid he was in his many-colored armor, horses he gave to all who asked, gathering wealth like a miser. Freely he shared it for his soul's sake." And there's some cool insight into the warrior culture too. In this poem, we learn about 3 unbeatable British warbands. Quote, "The 300 swords of the Sinfregen, the 300 shields of the Kinwarden, and the 300 spears of the Coling. On whatever expedition they might go together, they would never fail." This next poem could describe daily life across many of the kingdoms and cultures in the British Isles. It's a 6th century song for a mother to sing to her young son. Quote, "When your father hunted the land, spear on shoulder, club in hand, in his coracle he'd slay, fish as a lion does its prey. When your father went to the moor, he'd bring back heads of stag, fawn, and boar. The speckled grouse's head from the mountain, fish's heads from the falls of Oak Fountain. Whatever your father struck with his spear, wild pig, wild cat, fox from his lair, unless it had wings, it would never get clear." End quote. An echo of the British kingdom of Strathclyde can be heard in place names formerly part of British territory. Today's Dumbarton grew out of Dun Riadans, which means Fort of the Britons. North from the Fort of the Britons, what is today's Dumbarton Castle, is another fragment, a very large fragment, of British sovereignty in the area. It's a stone called Clach nam Briatain, which means Stone of the Britons. This stone tells us something about the era. What are today unassuming farms and glens were once significant political borders and the scenes of real tension. Back in the 500s, this marked the geopolitical border between the Strathclyde British and the Dal Riadans Scots. The Dal Riadans were an established part of the Scottish region's political scene from 500 AD. Their center of power was a hill fort of Donad, north of the British kingdom of Strathclyde. They were part of a continuous corridor of Gaelic culture, springing from the neighboring Irish region, and they spoke a Q-Celtic language, similar to modern Irish, but different from the P-Celtic languages of their neighbors the Britons and the Picts. They were linked back to Ireland by the highway that was the Irish Sea. The Dal Riadans would come to be known as Scots, eventually lending that title to the modern country we know today. but the Dal Riadans called themselves Gaels. The name Scots was a title given to them by the Romanized Britons, meaning a raider or a pirate. It has been suggested that this derives from the Gaelic word for sail, scod, and so Romano-British sentries, when they saw the sails of likely Gaelic pirates, might have yelled, "Scod, Scods," or "Sails, sails," eventually becoming Scots. This would have applied to people from the Irish region as well as western parts of mainland Scotland, as they were part of the same cultural and political orbit. It's important to note here that it isn't the case that the Gaels, or Scots, would go on to take over the whole of the Scottish region and hence set up Scots as the de facto term for the eventual country. It's the word itself, Scots, that would go on to become the primary vehicle for describing a northern European kingdom and people.
The traditional story of Dal Riadans' beginning is in that in 500 AD, a guy called Fergus MacErich led a host of people from Ireland to the western part of Scotland. Modern archaeology has some different ideas of how the Dal Riadans, or Scots, got established. Could they really have come over all at once with Fergus and set up a kingdom, like the Angles and Vikings did? The archaeology suggests a less traumatic story. The house types recovered from that period tend not to be of the Irish type across the water from the same period. If an invasion had occurred, Irish building habits would have been brought over as well. There's not a trace of Brittonic place names in the area either, it's Gaelic straight through, suggesting that there had not been a sudden influx of Gaels, but rather a long-established primacy of Gaelic culture. So perhaps what is closer to the truth is that both sides of the Irish Sea were closely enmeshed with a similar culture, i.e. the sea was not a divider. Fergus might have been the first king to rule the area from Dalradia as opposed to Ireland. It's suggested that Fergus' story is what historians call a foundation legend, kind of a PR stunt used by later leaders of the area to justify their rule. Up next are two political entities which unquestionably were consummate party crashers to the Scottish scene. First, the Angles, and then the Vikings. When the Romans were withdrawing south, the native Britons in northern England brought Germanic tribes over from Europe to serve as mercenaries along Hadrian's Wall. Most of these men were Angles, a people from what is today Denmark. These hired men soon decided that they'd rather carve out their own kingdom and so fought and drove off the native British establishment to form the two new Angle kingdoms of Bernicia and Deria. These combined later to become the Kingdom of Northumbria we know from earlier. At the height of its power in the 9th century, it stretched from Edinburgh and the Lothian area all the way down to York and the Pennines. Eventual invasion by two Viking brothers, Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ivar the Boneless, would crush resistance and make Northumbria part of the Danelaw. Aside from war, Northumbria contributed to the contemporary Christian writing scene through writers like Bede, a monk whose historical writings are key to our understanding of the entire period. Bede's history helps us understand not just the Northumbrians' culture, but also that of the Britons, Scots, and Picts. Northumbria hosted events like the Synod of Whitby, a meeting of Britain's leading churchmen in 664. The Synod of Whitby was called to resolve conflicting practices between the Columban Church to the north in Iona and the southern Roman Catholic Church based in Rome. The policies of the Church were important. They could allocate authority either to religious or state figures, between, say, the Pope or a local king. While the Roman Catholic Church held the Pope in Rome to be the leader of Christianity on earth, monks from the Irish monastery of Iona placed the ruler of a kingdom at the head of the church. An important rift between these two churches was on what dates Easter would be commemorated. It's not obvious why this would be important, but it did matter, at least as part of administration. The church mattered then because it was like the mainstream media of the day. Think of the church as a broadcast tower that is transmitting the king's ideas to his subjects. Before this was settled, as an example, the Northumbrian king Oswy and his queen Enfled were celebrating and fasting at different times, undermining the image of the royal court. The Roman Catholic mode of worship would win out at the Synod of Whitby. This solidified one strain of Christianity, Roman Catholicism, in Northumbria, and squared much of the Scottish region's Christian practices with the wider European model of worship. So as an aside, you might have heard of the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Arthur was said to have been a Briton who fought against the invading Anglo-Saxons and appears in a Welsh prophecy as the man who would save Celtic England in its hour of need. The film King Arthur with Clive Owen is set in this period and tries to add a historical twist to the tale, so if you have a few hours to spare, check it out.
Like the Picts, the name Vikings strikes an aggressive image, this time of a sea-born raider, pillaging and burning monasteries to the ground. The first assault on the British Isles came in 793 AD, when the monastery at Lindisfarne in Northumbria, a kind of Christian Las Vegas of the north, was snuffed out. A year later, the Vikings were arriving in the Western Isles. In 806, Iona, a Christian node in Dal Riadan territory, was pillaged. As the 9th century progressed, vast tracts of land across the British Isles would be effectively colonized by the Vikings. Dublin rose up out of this as a Viking center of trade in slaves. The sad fate of these people is memorialized by the recovery of their heavy, wrought iron chains. Vikings would violently shape local politics. In 839, the Pictish leadership would be defeated by the Vikings, creating a power vacuum that Kenneth MacAlpin filled. But the Vikings, like the Picts, were more than raiders and warriors. When I got to the Viking segment of the show, I realized that I didn't actually know anything about the Vikings, other than that they were hated and feared pirates. But after reading the work of historians like Neil Oliver, an entirely different picture developed. Some of the questions I wanted answered were, where do these guys come from? Why do they bother? Scandinavia, especially Norway, is a rough country where arable land is squeezed between the ocean and the mountains. Opportunity was scarce. By the late 8th century, power is becoming centralized, and so the chances for young men to achieve advancement in Scandinavia were becoming even narrower in an environment that was already scarce. So these guys formed what were something like business startups, with the startup capital being the ship and weapons, all staffed by a cohort of warrior business partners. They were also equipped with a powerful worldview that placed strength, glory, and honor as the highest virtues and cowardice as the lowliest vice. You get a sense of that in this Viking poem. Quote, a coward believes he will live forever if he holds back in the battle. But in old age he shall have no peace. Though spears have spared his limbs, cattle die, kindred die. Every man is mortal, but the good name never dies of one who has done well. I think that among the passions that drove these guys were included things like ambition, hope, and a chance to build a prosperous and secure life. But they didn't always win. At a site in England, the bodies of 51 Vikings, all men in their late teens and early 20s, were found in a mass grave, killed by the local Anglo-Saxon inhabitants they had planned to plunder. Not all Vikings were the same. There's diversity in the word. Norwegian Vikings tended to go to the Scottish and Irish regions. They settled Iceland, and there's written and archaeological evidence that they reached North America. Danish Vikings focused on the English region. The work of Swedish Vikings is less well known. Their history resembles more the merchant and trader, as well as a warrior. They worked their way into the vast landscape of Eastern Europe through rivers like the Vistula and Volga, down to the wealthiest and largest city of the world at the time, Constantinople, what is today Istanbul. The record is that they came as merchants, with some becoming mercenary guards for the local leadership. Early historic graffiti, written in Viking runes, has been found etched into the city. All connected up, the work of the Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish Vikings drew together a Viking trading empire, drawing in slaves, tribute, and loot from the British Isles, and coinage, jewelry, and even Chinese silk sourced from as far as the Middle East. Thousands of early historic coins minted in places like Baghdad have been found in burial sites in Scandinavia. So the Viking story is already what we know it to be, one of violence and theft, but it is also one of enterprise and accomplishment. And that's it. We hope you enjoyed that. We've described the players of the politics of the Scottish region during the early historic period, as played out between 5 separate political groups, each with their own language and culture.
So we've got Pictland, the native Celtic people who are more than just warriors.
The often sidelined British kingdoms and the kingdom of Dal Riadans, known as the Scots.
We've got the Angle Kingdom of Northumbria.
And the Vikings.
These were all key players on the map leading up to the formation of the Alban dynasty in 840 and then securing the idea of the Kingdom of Alba by around 900 AD.